and welcome to Roundtable number 54. I am joined today by Brian Berletic and Pepe Escobar, and this is a real delight. Two of my favorite people who are just big brains, and I'm just going to shut up and listen to these two gentlemen talk. Pepe, it's a delight to have you back on, man. Good to see you.
Very good. Thanks for having me. It's 4 p.m. in the capital of the multipolar world, everybody.
Yeah, and he's coming from Moscow. And in Thailand is, of course, Brian Berletic. Brian, my man, how's it going?
Going well. Thank you for having me, and great to share the screen with Pepe.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah. You guys have never been on my show together, have you?
Never. No, together, no.
I don't think so, yeah.
No, well, it's a delight to have you both on. So I think it's going to be a great show. Chat, hit me with a +1 to welcome our guests, and let's go off to the races. The thing I want to talk about is that Andrei Martynov did a video a few hours ago that I found really interesting because he was talking about the story of the Kinjal missile having hit a NATO base that was a fortified bunker, something like 200 feet of concrete, if the story is accurate. And they killed, apparently, between 150 and 200 NATO officers, like generals, colonels, a lot of contractors, people who were on top of a lot of the intelligence stuff going on in Ukraine. That this apparently happened, when was it, like in early March or something like that?
Yes, I think it was, a month and a half ago, maybe?
Yeah, something like early March, which is kind of interesting because back in March of 22 at Yabodiv, the Russians also hit a NATO base, which was, and they killed like 400 men there and blew up $400 million worth of gear. A yearly event, apparently. But the issue is that this story, a lot of people have been saying it's a conspiracy story, it's not real, but the story refuses to die. So, Pepe, I'll throw it to you. You think this is credible? And
the thing is,
go ahead.
What struck me from the beginning was the less than zero reaction by the Ministry of Defense. And absolutely no reaction from anybody, in fact. Mm-hmm. So there was a gag order from above. Don't discuss this and don't make it public. We don't know why.
You're talking in Russia.
Gun. Yes, I'm talking about Moscow. Mm-hmm. And I'm also talking about Washington. Because in Washington, obviously, this story never happened, and was never published anywhere. And when it showed up in some fringe websites, another conspiracy theory.
Right.
The thing is, this message was Mr. Kinzhal calibrated for maximum effectiveness. And apparently the other side understood what's going on. I had indirect confirmation. Of course, no direct confirmation. This is from Brussels. So I have my sources, especially in the European Commission and the EU, much more than in NATO itself. And these diplomats said, yes, people in NATO are absolutely freaked out with what happened. So basically, it was saying, yes, they know it happened, but they cannot talk about it. So the gag order obviously came from above. Obviously, none of that can be, okay, very important, everybody. We don't have a smoking gun about it. But the fact that, for instance, here in Moscow, especially for us foreigners, we cannot ask this question directly at the Ministry of Defense. They won't answer us. Mm-hmm. So when we talk to Russian military correspondents or Russian analysts here who have very good connections with the Ministry of Defense, they say, yes, we also could not go. Otherwise, we would have printed in our Telegram channels everywhere. So this thing is like a sort of a creature of the Black Lagoon scenario, isn't it? Does it exist? Does it not exist? Is it formless? Is it a blob? Does it live on the bottom of the lagoon? It's fascinating. But my hunch is that it happened, and then, okay, gag order.
Because from the point of view of NATO, they can't admit that this happened because the loss of this many high-level officers would merit a response, a radical response, potentially escalation, boots on the ground, all kinds of shit. It becomes a political quagmire to admit it. For the Russians, why would they not admit it? For the same reason, so as not to invite an escalation by NATO?
Absolutely, both points, Gonzalo. And the most important point is, okay, what is Putin, Gerasimov, Surovkin, Patrushev, what are they thinking? We're not in a hurry. We know that they don't want peace. We know they will continue to escalate. All right, so let's send them a message and let's see how they react. But they send a very discreet, obviously, graphically, cataclysmic, but extremely discreet message at the same time. And the discretion applies to both parties because nobody says anything about it. And we only have these echoes that they were spooked. And of course, from the US, it's absolute silence. It's much more than spooked. NATO, I could trust what I had from these NATO, this EU, EC diplomats, because they go back and forth with NATO. You know how Brussels works. I'm sure many of you listening to us know how Brussels works. The orders come from NATO, and then they go to EU, and then they go to EC. And then they go to the other European capitals. This is how the system works. But all these orders do not come from NATO. They come from Washington. So Washington, obviously, gag order immediately. Nobody talks about this anywhere.
But wouldn't this be the perfect pretext to escalate? Or is there too much internal fighting in Washington for a clear escalation?
Two very good points, Gonzalo. It would offer the perfect pretext to escalate if they could escalate, which they can't. And our friend Martyanov is basically spelling this out every day in his blog. No, they cannot organize a counteroffensive. They don't have anything. Second point. So yes, go ahead, please.
No, please. Give me your second point before I turn to Brian on the escalation issue.
And the Russians, what they do know is that they want to escalate. They want the counteroffensive. There are all sorts of dates going on from April 9 to April 30, well, in 2 weeks from now. Okay, are they going to do it? No, they can't, according to our best information, their own information, SVR, Guru, you name it. Okay, but at the same time, the rhetoric is off the charts, as usual, and the provocations continue. Okay, so it's time to send a message. So they probably wanted to send this message maybe 2 or 3 months ago, or by the end of the year, beginning of January. So they chose to do it in March. Doesn't alter much, in fact. But the most important thing is Mr. Kinzhal, because in the US, as all of you listening know, people think that the Kinzhal is is a cartoonish invention. So, okay, so this is what the Kinzhal does, and what the Kinzhal does to your military leadership. You want to keep escalating? Okay, I would say this is a Sun Tzu approach by the Russian general staff. Perhaps we are all wrong.
No, but let's posit that it actually happened. Okay.
Yes.
Could we say that what the Russians basically did is call the West's bluff? Because
yes.
I agree with you,
no
the
question.
escalation has been off the charts.
Yes.
So this is sort of like, okay, you up for escalation? Here,
exactly.
Motherfucker. Here's a perfect excuse.
but exactly, that's it. That's it. And you just need one move. And it's fascinating because everything that we have been seeing for over a year now, when it comes from Russia and when it comes from China, all it takes is one move, one declaration, one meeting, one joint statement, one attack. And obviously the other side doesn't listen because the other side, as we know, treats the best definition that I heard these past few weeks was from a Chinese scholar. The leadership in those Straussian neocon cycles, they treat Russia and China as unassimilable others that simply cannot be assimilated. Only a Chinese could come up with this concept. It's beautiful. So they completely understand the concept of the other, although probably many of them, they never read Lévi-Strauss in their lives. It doesn't matter, but they understand the concept of the other. And they understand that those barbarians, as Chinese scholars among themselves refer to Westerners, those barbarians, upstart barbarians, they simply cannot assimilate the other from Eurasia and from East Asia. And obviously they treat it as unassimilable.
Yeah.
You cannot be incorporated into our dominant hegemonic culture. That's a great definition, in fact. So okay, so the non-assimilated, they keep sending Sun Tzu moves to see if the hegemonic assimilated get it.
So we can say that Russia called the West bluff, and because they've been talking about, you know, Russia evil, they've been talking also about Poland. Poland, there's a big brouhaha of potentially throwing them as the next proxy army. But you believe, if this is true, and this is a big if, because
let's keep the if in play, of course,
because we have no real confirmation. But
no, we don't have a smoking gun, Gonzalo, and it's impossible at this stage, and it doesn't suit the Russians, and much less the collective West, right?
Yeah. Ryan, I want to bring you in about the possibility of NATO escalation. I mean, you're the man on top of the numbers of weapons. Where are we at in the West, and how broke is the West insofar as weapons is concerned?
Well, you know, again, if this actually happens, I think it would benefit both sides to not talk about it. For Russia, talking about Sun Tzu, you always leave your enemy a way to exit out. You don't put them on the spot and force them, unless for some reason you want them to. That's what that would have done. That would have forced the West. If they came out and said, look what we did to NATO leadership, that would have forced some sort of retaliation. In terms of weapons, we are watching the West exhaust themselves in terms of land-based weaponry. If they were to get involved in Ukraine, they would have to commit a significant portion of their air power and the munitions that their warplanes use. And this is something that they are saving for China. They have this conflict that they're preparing for with China, and they want to use their aviation and their naval forces for that conflict. If they decide to intervene in Ukraine and they start using these munitions there, they're not going to have enough to then also wage some sort of conflict against China. So this is the problem that they have. There's only so much that they can actually do to escalate them. Throwing in Poland, maybe. We've heard about this big military buildup that's going to take years to do in Poland. And when it's finished, their army is going to be just about the same size as Ukraine's was at the end of February 2022. So just to give people an idea, the scale that we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. And on Poland, if I may add, you know that, how can I put it? Not secret, but underground diplomatic think tank, person-to-person exchanges between the French and the Germans. They're actually discussing that what the Americans want to do basically is to give the leadership of the EU, especially in military terms, transfer it to Poland. And we are going to be sidelined. Of course, anybody in Paris or in Berlin with, I would say, minimalistic knowledge of what this thing is going already know that. The thing is how they're going to act against or try to come up with their own plan B when you have a non-government in Berlin led by liver sausage and with those absolutely toxic green Annalena, green 360 degrees assholes. And in Paris, you have a guy who's basically contested by 80% of the French population. And,
are you talking about Rothschild's twink? Oh, yeah, him.
Excellent. Okay, we should start using this as well, Gonzalo. I call it Le Petit Roi.
No,
he's too polite. I think we should hit harder. I agree.
Yeah, you know, I mean, be vulgar like me. Get on my level. Get low.
So, and it was fascinating that he apparently had a road to Damascus moment after those meetings with Xi in Beijing and Guangzhou. When 2 days after that, he starts saying, Europe should be a third independent superpower. We should consider de-dollarization. We should not be vassals of America anymore and all that. And you know the American response, what was it? Shut the fuck up, Le Petit Roi. And now he's trying to come up with a French plan, no, his plan, because he's a mega narcissist. My own plan for peace in Ukraine, which I want to discuss with the Chinese. So, so people asked the Chinese yesterday and today, do you know about this? I say, we have no idea. And we're not considering on top of it, you know. Same with Lula's Peace Club. The Chinese were extremely polite to basically dismiss Lula's idea of a peace club, especially because they know how Lula is ultra misinformed by the circle of jerks around him in Brasilia. This is another very, very serious problem. So the solution for Ukraine, obviously, the Chinese more than anybody else, because of the strategic partnership, comprehensive strategic partnership. No, Russia has already set the conditions. They're not going to move out. They're not going to make any concessions. This is it. This is what Peskov says every day. This is what Patrushev says in any interview to Russian media. The Chinese understand it. But of course, they have their 12-point plan, which is not a peace plan. It's a set of suggestions, which, of course, the Russians incorporate. They studied, okay, we agree with your suggestions. The problem is we don't have an interlocutor on the other side. Yeah. So maybe it should be the case of sending another Mr. Kinzhao business card to another location. Huh?
Oh, and by the way, that 12-point, yeah, that 12-point Chinese, no, that 12-point Chinese plan, I have absolutely no doubt that the Chinese ran it by the Russians.
Yeah, of course it goes up. Of course, because look, this is something that people in the West still don't understand. Everything strategically between Russia and China, not from now on, for the past at least 6 months, if not for the past year and 2 or 3 months, is decided at the highest level. And they are in sync. Okay, one simple example. The negotiations that led to Iran and Saudi Arabia, the foreign ministers in Beijing, you know, finally deciding to, okay, let's put our relationship on track again. They started with the Russians. The Russians start talking with both, okay, separately. This is something that I learned from the Minister of Foreign Affairs directly, with one of the Sherpas who work with Lavrov. I cannot tell her name for obvious reasons. But basically what she said, she's not a transgender, and he's not a transgender, by the way. So basically what this non-transgender Lavrov Sherpa said is, okay, we talked to the Iranians on one channel, we talked to the Saudis on another channel. Then when we have consensus on both sides, we get them together, and then we can go to another issue, a much more serious issue. Example, a solution for Syria. This is what they're doing. They talk to the Iranians first, then they talk to the Saudis, they put them together. Okay, they found a consensus. Okay, so now we have a consensus involving Syria, and let's bring the Turks as well. This is how the Minister of Foreign Relations works here. And then, in the case of Iran and Saudi Arabia, their relations back together, they kicked the ball to the Chinese. Sure. Let's say a few months ago, at least. So the Chinese clinched the deal, and they got all the credit because the deal was clinched in Beijing. So this is one simple example to all of you of how they work at the highest level and in sync on everything. The Minister of Defense, who just spent 3 days here, and he was received not only by Shoigu, he was received in person by Putin. He had a special audience with Putin. This is very, very rare for any Minister of Defense from anywhere on earth, you know. Yeah. And what were they discussing? What were they discussing? Of course, this is, let's say, the reading of the top media in Moscow. This was the reading by TASS, by Izvestia, by Vedomosti. So, yes, they were not talking about China selling or sending weapons to Russia. Russia doesn't need it. Russia can have 1 billion Shahed drones from Iran, no problem. They were talking about the next stage, which is missile defense for China. And China will need missile defense systems, top of the line, even what it's still being designed in Russia, from Russia when the next step, as Brian just said, when the next step of the war, which you all know what's going to be, circling around, revolving around Taiwan happens, I would say sooner rather than later, according to the Strauss and Newcomb cycles, right? So this is what they were discussing between yesterday and today. It's extremely serious.
Yeah, because I saw that meeting, and of course, Putin's big table, but he was
big
close
table.
up. But he was close up. You could always tell by the size of the table what the Russians or the Chinese think of their opposing number. That enormous round table with Macron and Ursula von der Leyen and Xi. That was hilarious.
Did you see the jungle in the middle, Gonzalo?
What?
Did you see there was a jungle in the middle?
Oh yeah.
No, there was a mini garden in the middle.
It was to chat for those of you who don't know. What's his name? Borrell, that imbecile who runs foreign policy for the EU. He was
a Spanish imbecile, exactly. Yeah.
Yes, because as a Brazilian on Pepe's side, as a Chilean on my side, we want nothing to be. We don't want to be identified with that asshole.
Definitely not. Yes.
Yeah, he said that Europe was a garden and the rest of the world was a jungle. So I think that was like a little tweak. And
the Chinese obviously got the message and turned it upside down.
And also, by the way, I mean, parenthetically, that was the most colossal bitch slap to Ursula to send her by the regular, getting her visa stamped and by the regular entry.
Visa stamp. Do you have anything to declare? Now strip.
just slapping her around, man. That was funny. But the point I wanted to say is that the meeting with Putin and the defense minister, whose name slips my mind, unfortunately, the Chinese
Li Shangfu.
Thank you.
Li Shangfu.
First of all, that Minister of Defense looked happy to be there, and it was a working.
Very happy. Oh yes.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was the kind of meeting that you're like, the shit is going to get done, and it was a clearly working meeting because of the documentation. There wasn't just protocol and just walking around and waving at the band, right? And so it's very obvious that this Eurasian alliance is a permanent thing. And everybody is just joining it. And I don't see really an endpoint for them in terms of gaining more adherence around the rest of the world, especially as the United States, as it flounders, it's just lashing out randomly. Now we have this issue in Sudan. We have issues all over the place. So the next stage, you guys are convinced that there's going to be a war with China, between the United States and China, before 2025. Would that be accurate?
No, we're not. I wouldn't say we are convinced, Brian. Please, we're not convinced. I would say we all of us independents, we are identifying a trend.
Yeah,
and obviously identify a trend which is going to be conducted by a bunch of Strauss and Newcomb total cycles is very complicated because they are irrational by definition.
Yeah.
So we don't know what they. Yeah, and we still, if we, for instance, if we guide ourselves by what Sy Hirsch basically told us, that the beginning of the whole Nord Stream operation was concocted by the toxic trio, Sullivan, Blinken, and Nuland. Right. So this would imply that these guys are actually what we all, of course, knew and had inferred, but now we have actual proof from sources close to the secret meetings, to National Security Council, etc., that these three are running American foreign policy essentially, because Biden, as we know, doesn't exist. No. Biden, between commas, is that thing that needs tons of meds every day, even to try to find his way to the toilet. So obviously he cannot decide. He's unable to think. So who are the thinkers? Are these intellectually shallow psychos? This trio, of course, and some others, and all sorts of epigons of Robert Kagan and company in their different silos, in State Department, CIA, etc. And obviously, because they are absolutely irrational and they are guided by extreme Russophobia. And apparently they have ways of implementing absurdities such as I described very well, the bombing of the Nord Stream, and convince everybody else to do it, even though, and this is something I would like to ask Brian's opinion about that. The thing that still nags me a little bit on Tsai's series of reports now is that he lets the CIA get away scot-free with the whole thing. I'm not convinced about that at all, as much as I admire Tsai. Brian?
Well, I mean, there's a lot there to address. So we were talking about Syria, for example, and we see how these conflicts are being resolved in the Middle East. And what led to that? That was resolution on the ground first, fighting on the ground, creating the conditions that basically painted the US and their allies into a corner. And then Russia and China asked all of their partners in the region, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and others, asking them, do you want to join them in the corner or do you want a way out? And people can see you're talking about them being irrational. It's very obvious they're being irrational. They're extremely ignorant about how all of this works. They began a proxy war with Russia without the ability to actually fight it. They thought these sanctions were going to absolve themselves of their military-industrial output problem, and it obviously didn't. Since I would like to think that there's a chance that they're not going to go to war with China or to start some sort of conflict. I think Russia is one thing that they are obsessed with. I think preventing China from surpassing the United States is the ultimate thing that they're obsessed with and want to stop. So we have to be very careful about what they're going to do. And because they're being irrational, it might not even be something that makes sense for them to do. And with Nord Stream, yeah, I think I agree. The CIA was not involved in that. I don't think so. I think there was a lot of actors involved in that, and I think like we're talking about this trio in the White House. So a lot of the things that they're saying and doing come out of these think tanks funded by these corporations, and they've been talking about these sort of things for years and years. I mean, when you read the think tank papers, they are so obsessed with Nord Stream. And they never said they were going to blow it up, but you could tell that was the next. You know, they have all of these options, and it's almost you're able to fill it in for them. Yeah, or we'll just blow it up. That's how desperate they are to stop this.
Yeah. Well, because my thinking is that, my thinking is the following: is that if assuming the early March attack happened and 200 odd men were killed, NATO people, right, which is a big bloody nose, very discreet bloody nose, but a bloody nose nevertheless, it would seem that the neocons, the trio of crazies that we're talking about, Nuland, Blinken, and Sullivan, and the Kagan morass and all that bullshit, that they would be thinking to themselves, you know, let's leave good enough alone. Let Zelensky burn through the rest of the Ukraine army and just turn our attention to China decisively, as opposed to keep on grinding with the Russia thing. Because we can look at the players in Washington. Now, obviously, the Pentagon wants no part of this war with the Russians because they know that their asses handed to them, right? And air power is not going to be a match for Russian air defense systems. And so their beautiful and extremely expensive Lamborghini planes, right, are going to get blown away like it's a demolition derby, for crying out loud, right? And they're going to look like fools. And on top of that, the Pentagon actually has recruitment problems, so they might not even have the ability to rustle up an army to ship off to Europe to fight the Russians. So the Pentagon is obviously against any escalation with Russia. The political support in the United States is rapidly deteriorating. So the issue would become, let's just forget about Ukraine and just pivot decisively towards China and just start banging that drum like there's no tomorrow. And we're already starting to see that kind of approach in the mainstream media, because one of the things about the mainstream media, of course, is that it is the propaganda arm of Washington. And because of it, often as not, it is immediately reflexive of the change of opinion in Washington. And you're starting to see more and more talk, you know, the Russia thing, you know, Russia is like, okay, there, but they're talking China, 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 right?
Exactly.
And so that's my sense of the direction of travel. And so the reasonable inference from these data points is the Americans figure that they have to go to war with China I was thinking in 2025, after the sanctions escalator, in that wonderful phrase of Mercouris's, after the sanctions escalator against China blows up in the face of the Americans and causes all kinds of economic havoc during 2024, then it would be the inevitable result of escalation against China would be a war in 2025. But considering the presidential election in 2024 and the fact that Biden will run again, and he's probably being pushed to run again because of his own crime family, and also because the neocons and crazies in State Department realize that a new administration, even potentially a Democratic administration, might remove them from the levers of power. They would want to start a war now with China, start escalation with China as soon as possible, and use any pretext for that escalation in 2023, while gently leaving the Russia thing on the sidelines and like, oh, let's forget about it because China. I mean, that's my thinking at this time. Pepe, what do you think of that?
Look, it's not bad, Gonzalo. It's not bad at all. I would say this is one of the top 3 scenarios, maybe. Yeah. Well, the process of throwing Zelensky under a bus has already started.
Yeah.
Slowly but surely.
Ironically, with the Cy Hirsch piece. With the Cy Hirsch piece, ironically. Yeah.
Exactly. So they are getting extremely impatient, and like cornered animals, they are getting more and more dangerous because the level of irrationality now can be off the charts. Absolutely. The Chinese, they got the message. I would say that this visit by the Minister of Defense is part of this whole process. They said, look, these crazies could even try to start something next year. So we have to be prepared, and for the moment, we are not. So they could have, let's say, a bunch of S-500s, for instance. And they will have direct access to the first S-600s as soon as they are tested and they're ready to go to the Russian armed forces. The Chinese will say, can we have a batch as well? And of course, in terms of small, medium weapons, the special relationship with Iran is going to be very, very handy as well. So expect a visit of the Chinese Minister of Defense to Tehran soon, if not in the next few days. But yes, Taiwan is, there's no question about that. The thing is, we can only speculate about a schedule. We can only speculate on how they will try to pull that off. We don't need to speculate in terms of how, if they try anything in the South China Sea, is going to be a total disaster for the Americans, because I assume that all of us agree on that. It's going to be a total disaster. And this was gamed, and all the games were a total disaster. Exactly.
Yeah, three sunk aircraft carriers minimum. If they minimum, exactly. So and there's an extra component of how they are freaking out so fast is the integration of all the relatively new multipolar organizations towards de-dollarization. Yeah,
the de-dollarization it can be. Well, in one of the podcasts that was recently was described as the multipolar world in revolt. I love that, because it's a sort of multipolar, a global South revolt, in different latitudes in the global South. It can be anywhere. It can be in West Africa. It can be in Brazil. It could be in Nigeria. In ASEAN, can you believe it? The ASEAN 10 discussing we should bypass the dollar. This is something that I never in my life could even imagine hearing.
Pepe, you're
like Brian is in ASEAN.
And more Abraham of all people talking about it.
Exactly.
Mr. NED himself.
Exactly. So it's at breakneck. We cannot keep up. It's a high-speed rail. It's too fast.
No,
right?
The thing is, you're behind the curve, Pepe. You know who's de-dollarizing or de-treasurizing, if you will? The French. The French have sold off 20% year over year. They've sold off 20% of their positions in treasury bonds. The French.
Exactly.
You know?
The French. Exactly. And this is something that obviously Macron heard from Xi in person during those famous 6 hours between Beijing and Guangzhou. According to some Chinese leaks, and these came obviously validated by the Chinese Minister of Information, is that she was talking to Macron about how the Anglo-Saxons fucked you up, the French nation, for over 200 years. You know, never forget that. We have very good memories. You should have good memories as well. Well, so where were we? BRICS Plus. BRICS Plus is going to be a fact starting from the upcoming summit in South Africa in August. Not to mention the BRICS Plus Q, which is gigantic. It's over 20. It's over 20 countries who want to be part of it. So in the beginning, we're going to have maybe Iran, Argentina, and Egypt. And then there's Turkey, there's Kazakhstan, there's South Korea, Indonesia. Everybody's on the list, right? Yeah. And a lot of Latin America, a lot of South Americans would like to be part of it after Argentina, exactly. Shanghai Cooperation Organization. With Iran as it's going to be a full member this year, and Saudi Arabia already said we want in, and we want in now. So obviously in the next summit they're going to discuss, okay, how we're going to bring Saudi Arabia as soon as possible. Eurasia Economic Union, extremely important. You know who's in Beijing this week? They will be back at the end of this week. Sergei Glaziev and his #1 economic advisor Dmitry Mityayev, which I had the honor to meet last month off the record. And we talked openly about everything. It was a real honor, in fact. They don't do this with many foreigners. In fact, with nobody. And they said, look, it's obvious that politically you cannot print what we discussed, which I did not. I wrote about what we discussed economically. It is very difficult, but they're making progress. Because the problem, as another specialist in fintech here told me last week, this time last week, he said, look, the process is extremely complicated, but we have a plan. We have our own plan. If we manage to sell a new payment system and then a new currency based on commodities to mega businesses in Russia and in Kazakhstan, in other nations of the Eurasia Economic Union, then we have a very strong head start, and then we can convince other members across Eurasia of different organizations, in this case, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, why don't you try our system? And then we're going to have what? India, Pakistan, Iran, everybody trying the same system. Of course, guys, I'm giving you the straightforward, short version of an extremely complicated process. Yeah. But it was a very sobering conversation because I got the handle of how complicated this is. At the same time, they're saying, no, we have our own plan B. Plan A is what Glaziev is designing with the Chinese. So what is he doing this week in Beijing? He's discussing with the Chinese what the people at the Eurasia Economic Commission, which is part of the Eurasia Economic Union, is discussing, designing, thinking, etc. And the Chinese are going to have their own input. The Chinese, as we all know, they are very wary of antagonizing the American financial system. So it has to be something that they need to be sure that they will be able to get away with it. And for the moment, this is impossible, as we all know, right? Yeah. But the fact that this train is rolling and it's picking up speed, it's very, very encouraging. So soon, let's say soon in a matter of 2024, right, to be more realistic, we could have the Eurasia Economic Union, BRICS Plus, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all representatives of all the members sitting on the same table and discussing, okay, can we agree on one single non-dollarized currency based on commodities, gold, or both? And can we start trying it? Can we have trials, practical trials? So this could happen in the next few months. It's not far-fetched at all. Yeah, so because I think this is for all of you. It's a brief introduction of where we're at the moment, which is, I would say this vector is even more important than the military vector, in fact.
I want to ask you something. You said that this is plan A, but what's their plan B? Because you mentioned that they had a plan B.
No, I'm sorry. The plan A is the straightforward new currency based on commodities and or gold that Glaziev has been working on this for years, in fact. And he's trying to bring the Chinese in. The plan B is, okay, let's start with the payment system, and then we go straight towards big businesses in Russia, in Kazakhstan, and even in trying to bring Chinese big businesses as well. So if I didn't express myself well, plan A is a Glaziev, plan B is people who work with Glaziev but also have a plan B.
Okay. Because, Chad, for those of you who don't understand this, see, the currency that Pepe is discussing is not the yuan or the ruble or rupee.
Exactly.
No, it would be an artificial currency that is really just an accounting currency that would be used for transactions. And each currency would float against this independent currency. In Chile, we actually have a system called the Unidad de Fomento, which is an inflation-adjusted unit of currency.
Can you explain that, Gonzalo?
Sure, no problem. The Unidad de Fomento, which literally means unit of growth or unit to foment. That's the literal translation. It was implemented when Chile had a very high inflation immediately after the Allende regime. And the idea was that because inflation was so rampant, right? You instead of selling large assets in escudos at the time, then later pesos, you would sell them in these units. They're called UFs, Unidad de Fomento. And for instance, to give you an example, my apartment in Chile, when I purchased it, it was 8,000 unidades de fomento. This was back in 2000, and it was equivalent to about $180,000. Okay. And what happens is that the Unidad de Fomento is readjusted by inflation every day. Okay. Just a little bit, and just tweaking a little bit, following whatever the inflation is. Okay. And so what happens is that it's an artificial currency that is never exchanged. There are no Unidad de Fomento bills. It's strictly for contracts. And the Unidad de Fomento is readjusted for inflation on a daily basis. Now, if you had something similar, an artificial unit that is the exchange mechanism, let's call it, for the sake of argument, in this one we'll call it the UF, just an equivalency sake. And so it would be adjusted against the rupee, against the ruble, and against the yuan on a daily basis, and each of these currencies would float against this unit, the UF, and therefore it would never be a basket of currencies. It would never be an individual currency carrying the weight of being the reserve currency. It would be this artificial construct that is used in contracts from everything from purchasing a home to big factories and all the rest of it. In fact, in Chilean businesses, almost everything, insofar as asset valuation, is counted in UFs, because that way it holds the value over time.
It holds the value, exactly.
Yeah. And so in terms of accounting, it becomes an extremely effective and efficient means of transacting assets, because by having this artificial unit, you can compare and contrast, how much has the valuation of some property, for instance, actually increased relative to inflation. When I sold my apartment, I purchased it in 2001 at 8,000 UF. I sold it at 13,500 because it had increased in value because of location and other factors. But in terms of actual pesos, actual dollars, it had, since it was constantly being readjusted for inflation, it was much higher. I mean, you see how the mechanism works. Okay?
Yes. Yeah.
And it's a great way to have an artificial unit like this that, like I said, it's never transacted as a currency. Some companies are crazy enough to issue bonds in UFs, but it's always a little bit junky. So you're not quite sure if you want to get into that particular bond. But the point remains, it's a very easy and effective way, because if you have multiple participants, in Chile, it's just Chile, it's just the peso, right? But if you have multiple countries operating with this artificial currency, and each of these currencies is floating independent, then to you as a business or what have you, you just have to pay attention to your currency vis-a-vis the artificial construct, the UF. And you don't have to be worried about what's my exchange rate if I have rupees against the ruble because I want to buy from the Russians or sell to the Russians, as the case may be.
But there will be an extra problem, for instance, as it stands. The yuan is not convertible in practice, not yet. And the ruble is under sanctions. Exactly. So the yuan will have to be fully convertible. And this is something that the Chinese still don't want.
Yeah, but if it's convertible to an artificial unit,
yes, exactly. That changes the exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Because it would be a single conversion as opposed to convertibility with rupees or rubles or whatever else.
Yes. When next time we meet, they're gonna explain me some of it about the plan B. They said it's not gonna be a new coin. You know, a lot of people have been floating the new coin. So probably something similar to the Chilean. That's you got my attention with it. It could be something similar to the Chilean scheme. Absolutely.
Yeah, ask them. And it's a great idea. And it's very, very efficient in capital markets, okay, and capital expenditures. Okay, so yeah, float the idea. Who knows? Maybe in this conversation we wind up changing Chinese policy. But
but I'm very, very curious what Glaziev is discussing with the Chinese, because this is a very, very serious discussion, and it's great because they respect Glaziev immensely, and at the same time they are afraid of not too fast. You see. That's always the Chinese approach.
Yeah, the problem with the Chinese right now is that they see the oncoming train.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
They know they have to get off the rails. And so they can't time it too quickly. They're going to have to jump off one way or the other, and soon. And so the issue becomes, well, do you have the courage of your convictions and go for broke with the BRICS economies? Or how are you going to play this? Or are the Chinese, and this is something that I've always wondered, would the China, because we all know the exposure that China has to the American-dominated financial markets. Right?
Of course.
And so the issue becomes, will the Chinese decide unilaterally to say, fuck it, we'll take the hit? Because they have the courage to do that. And they have the political power and the political will to potentially say to their people, look, we're going to have to go through 3 years that are going to be horrifying because we're just going to chop it off with the Americans and just isolate. Isolate not from the global economy, but from the American capital markets. And that's going to give us a huge hit, but it'll be worth it long while. Because the Chinese Communist Party has the political power to do such a thing. The question becomes,
of course they can, and now they are totally unified, Gonzalo. Now the Politburo is Xi's Politburo, completely. So whatever he decides, all the Magnificent Seven will decide. I would say this is a very plausible for the near future. Let's put it this way: if they see
they just chop it off,
yeah, exactly. And obviously they will have to be convinced that there's no other way out. And considering that they have very good independent economists around the world who advise them or who are in contact with them, Michael Hudson is one of them. I'm sure they would ask this question to Michael. There's no question about that. You know.
Yeah, I want to get on. I want to get Michael Hudson on. Sorry, Brian, I interrupted you.
You should. You should, please, as soon as you can. Absolutely.
Well, if you know him, send him an email and tell him. You know, just like.
Yes, of course. I'm reviewing his book now. In fact, I should finish my column tomorrow. Oh. And a lot of people are asking me, can you get Michael for us? Okay, I can help some people, of course. But Michael is absolutely, and his book about the collapse of antiquity, where he examines how Greece and Rome were basically founded financially on creditor oligarchies. It's something, it's beyond spectacular, you know. It's absolutely outstanding. No review will do justice. I'll only enumerate some, and okay, people, buy this book and read it. Spend, it's a complicated book to read, especially because you have to be at least minimally familiar with the history of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. He does his best, of course, to explain, but and it's great because he went to many of the sources that he used are stuff that we studied in college, like Sallustius, Tacitus, for instance. You know, perfect. You know, Plutarch. You know, he cites Plutarch all the time. So this is great. This is going to help a lot of people. But
what's the name of the book?
A book like this coming up right now, but well, how many people around the world will be capable to write a book like this and right now? And he makes the direct connection. This look. This is the fundamentals of the financial system in Western civilization. Comes from here.
The Destiny of Civilizations, is that the book?
Okay. No, it's The Collapse of Antiquity. The collapse of antiquity. Yes. Yeah. Can I read just a little bit for you guys? I just can't resist it.
Okay.
I'm sure our viewers are gonna love this.
Okay.
Look, this is something. It's part of one of the first chapters. Basically, he's saying something that I'm sure very few people know. That the monetary practices in Greece and then in Rome, they came to the Aegean and the Mediterranean brought by merchants and traders from the Levant and from Syria. And that's fascinating. So this means that everything came from West Asia, and then it came to the West, in the Aegean and Mediterranean. And the difference is something that he takes dozens of pages to explain. Before that, in all these West Asian civilizations, when there was a new ruler coming to power, he would erase all that. So there was a clean slate for everybody. And the difference in Greece and then in Rome is that, no, the creditor oligarchies, they were too strong, so they kept going. And this was the basis of neoliberalism, in fact. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine? What? 5 or 6 economists will be able to make this connection today, right? Well, Michael is one of them, and probably the best. So he says, look, with no tradition of debt cancellation and land redistribution to restrain personal wealth seeking, Greek and Italian chieftains, yes, this was before democracy in Greece, and of course the empire and the republic in Rome, right? Warlords, and what some classicists have called mafiosi. And it's very interesting because this classification by classicists, they are all Anglo-Saxons, not Italians. They classify these warlords as mafiosi. They imposed absentee land ownership over dependent labor, binding indebted clients to the land and obliging them to work off chronic dependency in the form of labor service. It's like he's describing Western neoliberalism nowadays, isn't it? Yeah. Fascinating, isn't it? Fascinating. Well, that was a taste of the book.
Okay, so I pinned it. It's The Collapse of Antiquity by Michael Hudson, and I'm going to redouble my efforts to get him on the show. It'll be a delight.
Fantastic. Yes. Yeah. Great.
Brian, we've totally sidelined you. I've been a
let's bring Brian. Let's bring Brian.
No, I could listen to Pepe all day. It's no worries at all. I was just going to say, though, we're talking about the financial system and all of these moves being made to change it. And I think Russia, China, and some others, they understand how deeply rooted many other countries are in the old system. And they know it's going to be very difficult to convince them, even if they want to, but it's such a process to make this transition. They also know that as this continues, the U.S. is going to wield sanctions more and more because they have no other option. And when the U.S. and Europe wield these sanctions, it's just going to make it all that much easier to sell the transition away from this whole system. So what Gonzalo, you were talking about China on the rails and wondering when to jump off. I think this is a game where they're pushing for this change. They're also letting the West help push also with these sanctions. It's a complex process, and the West and their attempt to use sanctions on everyone is going to help. Actually, it'll be a catalyst, and they're depending on that, I think.
I think the problem with the Americans is that they started sanctions with the little countries. They started with Cuba, right? And then Iran, and then Venezuela, which economically speaking, in the Western globalized system, were paltry. They were small fry. And they decided that this was the go-to tool when you didn't want to send an army to invade or destroy. And they kind of like lost track of the fact that sanctions only work with trivial economies. I mean, I don't mean any disrespect to the people of Cuba or Venezuela or Iran, but they are relatively trivial in the global scheme.
Relatively small economies, now.
Yeah,
let's put it this way.
But what happened was that with Russia, they didn't seem to. They actually bought their own bullshit that Russia is just a gas station with nukes. They bought the bullshit and didn't.
They bought it, exactly. Yeah. They fabricated it and they bought it. Yes.
Yeah, and they believed their own bullshit, and they didn't realize how central the Russian economy was to the European economy, most certainly, but also to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world wants to continue trading with Russia because Russia has so much stuff to sell. It's not just commodities, but it's also high-tech technologies of various sorts, right? And so they were fools. And this, to me, just speaks of a Western leadership class that is completely detached from reality. My own notion is that the Western leadership class, the people who are in charge today, are people who the process of selecting them is radically different than the qualities need to actually be good at their job. There is a split between competence in what you can actually do, and your ability to navigate the Ivy League schools, the think tanks, the sinecures, to advance to positions of leadership. And so that's why we have a leadership class that is extremely competent in internal politicking, but complete disasters insofar as actually carrying out their jobs insofar as what they're doing. It's sort of like they train to be welders and then they're supposed to be painters. It's just two different things. And the process of selecting for one does not mean quality or competence in the thing that actually matters. And we're paying for it now because, I don't think that either of you would dispute that the leadership class of the West is completely incompetent. They don't have a clue. And what troubles me is that there doesn't seem to be a second tier, a bench of leaders who are coming up and who will right the ship of the West. Full disclosure, I'm a man of the West. I am culturally, historically a man of the West. I've lived all my life in the West. And so I don't want to see the collapse of the West. And yet it seems to be inevitable at this point. Pepe, do you see this ship getting righted at any time soon?
No, I don't. And to complement what you just said, I heard this from a very well-educated German. He explained it in a few sentences. He said there was a lag in our educational system of roughly 20 years. That famous generation that got us Helmut Schmidt, for instance. The fall of the, in fact, the disappearance of any quality of the whole German educational system for 2 decades. It's what brought us Annalena 360 degrees, essentially. And that was an excellent explanation. And he was terrified, as a well-educated German, that it's probably going to take us another 2 decades to be back to what we had during the time of Helmut Schmidt. So we're still going to get for this decade and then for the next a lot of Annalena 360 degrees, and that or Robert Habeck, their Minister of Finance, that a green stupidity, or all the Americans, obviously, better than anybody, or and in France you have basically bankers' emissaries fabricated out of nothing, which is the case of a very ambitious provincial guy named Emmanuel Macron, not from Paris. People from the provinces in France, when they get to Paris, their obsession to become somebody is something cosmic. So they identify that, okay, let's manipulate this guy. So they start grooming him when he was still at the Ministry of Finance. And then they invented a party for him. They invented the non-political program for his new party, and they put him in power. And that's what we have in the West nowadays. It's or in the case of Latin America, we have Bolsonaro. Well,
and even in the military, especially the U.S. military, people are being promoted because of their political obedience, not their capabilities. And that's why you have generals who even think that it's a good idea, even if they know that these statistics that they're giving out are false, that they even think that it's a good idea to do that. just shows how ill-equipped and incompetent they are. And where are people that actually know what's going on and actually know what to do about this? And the system is engineered because it wants to go in a direction that is irrational. So it's engineered to root out anyone who is rational that's going to try to point it out and put the whole thing back on the right track. And I think Larry Johnson talks about this all the time regarding the Central Intelligence Agency and how that whole organization has been, they weeded the whole organization of people that actually could do their job, and that they just have people who will put out information that is politically expedient. But when you do that over a long period of time, the whole system becomes divergent from reality, and it's unable to make decisions that need to be made to achieve anything, even the mildest of success.
Spot on. That's it.
Yeah. Sorry, I got a little distracted with the chat because the chat was going in a direction. But
do you want to read? Do you? If there are any questions, Gonzalo, go ahead from the chat.
Yeah. Chat, hit me with some questions, and the good ones I'll pop into the broadcast.
Okay.
Yeah, but to go back to the issue of the thing that concerns me is China's reaction at this time, because we all agree that they see the train coming at them. They see that their time is limited to hop off the tracks. And so the issue becomes not just economically, because economically the United States is in the most fragile position it's ever been that I can think of since the Great Depression, to tell you the truth. Because as some of you may know, I have a bit of a background in finance. I ran some money for a while during the global financial crisis, and I was fortunate enough to make out okay. And so I'm more or less familiar with the shit going on financially speaking. And insofar as the American situation is concerned, if the Americans go so far as to really antagonize that Chinese to the point that the Chinese cut off from the American capital markets, yeah, sure, China will take a huge hit, but it is as nothing compared to what will happen to the American economy. The American economy will crash absolutely, and the American dollar will hyperinflate like a banana republic. I mean, it would be like Zimbabwe in Washington, D.C. And so the issue becomes, we are in an extremely delicate position here financially. Forget about the war making. I mean, setting that aside, if there is a true conflict where economic relations are cut between China and the United States and the West generally, there's no going back. We're talking about a complete collapse of the American and the Western economies, and so that's why I'm so concerned as to what is China's position. What will China do? Because ultimately, we all see that the Americans have gone insane. I think that that's pretty much, okay, perhaps I'm being a little bit too blunt about it, but the people in leadership in the West do not seem to know what they're doing, and they seem to be going from bad to worse. What will the Chinese do that would, number one, provoke the Americans, and what other things
this is not a Chinese culture, Gonzalo. Never. Yeah, they never provoke.
I know. And so the issue becomes, how can they smooth this over so that the coming conflict, the Sino-American conflict, doesn't actually explode? Is there anything that the Chinese could do to stop this train? I think that's my question.
What they are doing now, essentially, you remember putting in 2007, let's have a Lisbon to Vladivostok free trade zone. The Chinese in 2013, they said, okay, let's have a Shanghai to Madrid free trade zone. And their Shanghai to Madrid includes the whole of Africa and most of Latin America. So in fact, the Belt and Road, the new, as I call them, the new Silk Roads, even before they were conceptualized, it's a global trading system where China is, let's say, the primus inter pares. Of course, not in terms of domination, but because they are the largest trading nation on the planet. And most countries around the global south, their number one trade partner is China. We are already on our way, in Southeast Asia, where Brian is, it's more than obvious. In Central Asia, which used to be an area of, it still is in linguistic terms, of course, in some investment preserve of this Russian Soviet Empire. But now the Chinese are carving themselves spaces all across Central Asia, in West Asia, in Iran, and soon in Syria as well. Northern Africa, of course, at least 35 to 40 countries across Africa, and selected spots in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, etc. So the Chinese are going global. And they're going global with not with a warmongering, war of terror program. They're going global with a trade development connectivity program. And that's the beauty of the New Silk Roads. With, of course, there are lots of problems from the beginning. They are tweaking the system. In the beginning, it was heavily geared towards Chinese corporations. Now they are listening to their partners, so they listen to Laos complaining, or Malaysia complaining, or Indonesia, etc., and the Africans as well. They're fine-tuning it, and it's no wonder that this year, 2023, they're going to relaunch BRI, the Belt and Road, globally. There's going to be a summit in Beijing to basically relaunch BRI post-COVID, right? Yeah. So this is not only a trade connectivity project, it's their overarching foreign policy concept.
Yeah.
Why does Xi always talks about BRI in every important statement? Because this is their foreign policy, essentially. And this is something that the Western leaderships, they still don't get it. They still don't. And the Germans, can you believe that the Germans didn't get it? One of the terminals of the Belt and Road is Duisburg, an inland port in the Ruhr Valley, which is, it's essential for the German economy. So obviously you cannot pick a fight against Germany, even if you are ordered by the Straussian neocon cycles. You can't. The French, they have they took all the CEOs of the CAC 40, as we say in Paris. The
40, the CAC 40.
Exactly, the Forbes 40 or Forbes 50 of France. Everybody was in the macro, and they clinched mega deals with the Chinese. So from a business oligarchy, French business oligarchy point of view, this trip was wow. Yeah. From heaven. It was great. So they know they simply cannot. So, and that influenced Macron saying we cannot be. He knows that. And as a banker, Gonzalo and Brian, he knows that you cannot be slaves of those fucking assholes. It's obvious. It's
so your vision is that the Chinese are going to try to spread their relationships far and wide, so as to make it impossible.
It's what they're doing already. It's what they're doing already.
Okay. Yes. Look, let me turn the topic a little bit to Ukraine, and a very good question here comes from John Ashley Smith. Please ask Brian if he thinks it is possible or likely that Russia preempts this Ukrainian offensive with an offensive of their own, in the fashion of the SMO when the SMO began. And by the way, to add a few data points, it seems that the consensus from mainstream media in the West is that the vaunted spring offensive of the Zelensky regime amounts to 35,000 combat troops, which is
not more than that, apparently.
Not more than that, and which is
40,000.
And so,
Brian, jump in, Brian, on this one.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't underestimate what they can do. A lot of people did that before the fall offensive last year. Regarding Kharkov and Kherson, when you really look at Kharkov and Kherson, it was actually a huge loss for Ukraine. They lost an entire army. They've been sitting around ever since, waiting to get a new one so that they can launch this offensive. But that said, people should temper their expectations regarding what might actually unfold on the battlefield. We've watched Russia many times. If they feel they're going to lose a large number of troops, or possibly be encircled in a certain position, they'll just withdraw, because this isn't about territory. They want to destroy the Ukrainian military. And they see the West pumping in equipment, training up men to create yet another army for Ukraine to use. They want to destroy that. So preempting it with their own offensive, I don't think so, because the realities of modern warfare, especially in Ukraine, is that when you come out from behind your defenses and you try to push forward into defended territory, you're going to suffer huge losses. And Russia doesn't need to do that. They have an advantage in long-range weapons, artillery, precision-guided weapons. They're using their air force more and more now. They can just sit there and wait, and they could absorb and blunt this offensive, ravaged Ukrainian forces, even if they lose territory in the process. The question people should ask themselves is, once Ukraine is done, wherever they end on the map, what are they going to do then? There's no more artillery rounds for them. There's no more, these tanks. They can't even scrape together the number they said they would the first time. Where are they going to get more tanks? How long is it going to take to train more tankers to operate them? So this is the problem that they're in, and this is Russia's approach is just patience and attrition, and this is what they have been doing over the last year plus now.
Yeah, and so the Bakhmut situation, I mean, we've been talking about Bakhmut for months now at this point. You would have thought that the fucking city would have fallen by now, and they're still holding on, and they're still throwing more troops into the mix. What are they thinking? I mean, why just give it up already? I mean,
no, because they fell into the trap, Gonzalo.
Yeah,
they fell into the trap. They did completely. And the Russians are just, more troops, no problem. Okay, meat grinder.
Yeah. It's like throwing filet mignon and getting hamburger meat out of it. It's just, what are they doing? And the question becomes: is it an issue of ego at this point? Is it an issue of political credibility that they just?
Well, Zelensky is not exactly a military commander. Now, the guy is a third-rate actor. And Zaluzny, from the beginning, was telling him, this Bakhmut, Artem, it's completely absurd. We need to retreat. No, we need more troops. There you go.
Yeah,
and obviously, those idiots in NATO were saying, more troops, more troops. Same thing, right?
And he visited Bakhmut twice, and now he just visited Avdiivka. So that's another commitment they're not ever going to be able to give up. They'll have to fight to the last man.
But look, I think this is very, very important. There are some Russian military correspondents on the terrain in their Telegram channels. They are saying, be very careful about any kind of offensive directed towards trying to cut off the land bridge between Kherson and Crimea. This is very, very serious. Let's say that they have a shot. On 1 to 10, their shot is 0.3, but the shot is still there. So I would say that the Russians are not taking that lightly, because there is a possibility. Who knows?
That they could
exactly. And if that happens, this would be wow. Of course, in physical, geological, geographical terms, much more than in PR. You simply cannot have this land bridge cut off. So they are, I think most of the defenses are, Brian, is that it? Most of the defenses are concentrated in this intersection between Crimea and Kherson, right?
Yeah, well, they did there and also in the Donbas region. But something people should keep in mind is that there still is the bridge, the Crimean bridge. They would have to destroy that. And there's also multiple ports and also airports that they could still, I mean, the population might suffer, the economy in Crimea might suffer, but any sort of military efforts for Russia could still be sustained. We have to remember their military operation in Syria is not insignificant, and they've been supplying that by air and by sea the entire time. So Crimea is much closer than Syria is. So I just think they'll do that. They'll get the PR points for sure. You already know pro-Russian accounts, they'll lose their mind if Ukraine were to make it to the coast. But in reality, they're still going to be out of weapons, out of men. They're going to be overextended, and there's still ways to resupply Crimea. So it will be politically, it'll look bad, but strategically, I think it's still going to leave Ukraine in the same place they are right now.
In the same place, yeah. No, it's a good point. I just wanted to reaffirm to all of you that it's very good that this discussion in Russia is open. This is discussed here. This is discussed in Telegram channels. This is openly debated in the Russian talk shows. And it seems you have to consider all the contingencies.
Yes.
At least, you know. And there's another point which is interrelated, and it struck me since I came here last month. The best definition was from a Rosneft executive, and he was not happy with it. He said, we need to move to the next stage. For the moment, this is an almost war. I think it applies perfectly, you know. And in terms of public opinion in Moscow, the Donbass practically it's non-existent. I was struck. I was trying to buy a badge. I couldn't find it anywhere, and nobody could explain to me why you cannot buy any mementos or commemorative merchandise, let's put it this way, in American style, on Donbass. It doesn't exist here. So it is for a lot of people in Moscow, it's a war like could be in Mogadishu. This is very striking, and this country is at hot war with the collective West. This is very, very serious.
Yeah. But so, are the people in Russia aware that they are in this hot war with NATO, with the West?
More and more people, yes. Of course, I haven't been outside of Moscow, but everybody that I talked here, they more or less tell me that the mood changed a lot from February last year to where we are now. People seem to be now fully conscious that the whole collective West is against Russia, but for the moment, Russia is not under threat. And that's there's an element of complacency. That's not very good. And at the same time, they understand that what the Kremlin essentially, and let's say the media, the talk shows at night, and TASS, Izvestia, etc., what they're trying to do is to try to explain how the whole thing works. And they are relatively successful on that. So most people now they have enough information to see, okay, so they know what they're doing. They know where this is leading. At the moment, we are protected. We're not going to be bombed by NATO tomorrow or by the SBU for that matter. But at the same time, they are not totally involved. It's something relatively distant for most people. I would say that this can be dangerous. Sorry?
Even after the terrorist attacks against
even after the terrorists, especially after the attack against Daria and the attack against Vladen, the blogger. So this snags me a little bit. I want to get deeper into it, talk to more people about it. For instance, I talked to some volunteers from here who went to Donbass and came back. And they said, it's true. When we come back here, people have no idea what we have been through over there. It's true. There is a you know,
a disconnect.
It's a disconnect. It's asymmetric, the whole thing. I think this is a bit dangerous, and I would say that perhaps publicity campaign, let's put it this way, and not in terms of everybody here is patriotic, and we're going to see it on Victory Day on May 9th. There's going to be an explosion of Russian patriotic feeling, of course. But the fact that the war seems to be on purpose kept very far away from Moscow and St. Petersburg, the big cities, this could be dangerous.
This is a conundrum.
It's a gut feeling, guys. This is not analytical at all. It's a gut feeling. Yeah.
No, and this is a problem for the West, because if they want to escalate vis-a-vis Russia, if they want to transfer weapons over to Ukraine that can strike deep inside Russia and really make the Russian people feel the pain of this conflict, all that's going to do is stir up a hornet's nest. That will give Moscow the political capital it needs to escalate exponentially. And so this is, I think this is one contributing factor as to why they haven't been sending these weapons. And I think this is the problem for Ukraine. The more successful they are on the battlefield, the more stirred up the Russian people will become, and the more able Moscow will be able to mobilize a response to it.
True. Yes.
Yeah, because in the West, you know, the propaganda 24/7 that comes out of the legacy media is just off the charts, and it is just completely detached from reality. I mean, some of the stuff that you hear, it's just crazy. I mean, everything from the most basic thing that, oh, Putin is Putler, you know, the new evil dictator, as if he's acting alone and not as the entire Kremlin, you know, bureaucracy behind him in this conflict. They have all kinds of crazy ass notions that are just bizarre. And so basically here it's complimentary that in Russia, it's sort of like almost la-di-da. I mean, that's what you seem to be sensing at this time. That's just a weird situation.
That's a weird contrast.
Yeah,
it is. Yeah. Well, I get all this trash on my inbox every day, guys, and it's I don't read it anymore. No, it's well, no.
It's weird because the people in the West are so unhinged about this, and yet for Russia, this actually is existential, and the population really, I mean, it's not that they don't know that there's this danger, but you know, it's not urgent for them in the same way it has been made urgent in the heads of people all across the West. I mean, they've become deranged by it. A lot of people are totally unhinged.
Well, what bothers me is I know we talked a little bit before, but I still want to circle back to the issue of Poland, because the Polish leadership just seems just kind of insane about wanting to get into this war somehow or another, and they clearly don't have the political backing of the people of Poland, but they want.
No, they don't. But these people are. Oh God. Okay, I'm gonna try.
They're not democratic. That's for sure.
I'm gonna try to be diplomatic. They have a Lebensraum syndrome. This,
really?
especially these Polish old aristocrats and from older families, they still think in terms of the Poland-Lithuania Commonwealth.
Yeah.
So they want to get the lands that they had at the time. It is a Lebensraum syndrome. There's no question about that. And they think, okay, we have to incorporate all of Galicia. It was always ours. So half of Ukraine was always ours. And then the Hungarians are going to say, what about our Transcarpathia? And the Romanians, what about? Exactly. So everybody's going to. So in the end, Ukraine is going to be back to 1654, which was that little thing around Kiev, and not anything else. And Malorussia and Novorossiya will be back to Russia, which they were for centuries. So this is something that might happen, and I'm not sure that the Kremlin would be adverse to it, as long as there is the famous 300-kilometer or 400-kilometer no man's land between Poland and Russia. Exactly. Yeah.
Which would be this rump Ukraine state. Yeah, because I mean, like, you know, at the beginning of when Putin gave his speech at the start of the SMO, he actually alluded to something about Poland and having some territorial issues there. It was gently floated out there at the very start of this. And I've always had the suspicion that the Russians, two things. I think that the Russians are going to eventually have to physically take control of the entire country and install a friendly regime in Kiev.
But they don't want that, Gonzalo.
No, they don't want it, but they're going to have to.
Because then they're going to have to, you break it, you own it. They didn't break it.
Yeah.
And then they will own it. Exactly.
Yeah, you're exactly right. But they will be forced to, because are they going to allow NATO to basically start putting missiles right on
Kiev? Missiles are exactly. It's wow. It's a vicious circle. Absolutely.
Yeah. So they can't allow an independent Ukraine whatsoever its state at the end of this conflict. And if they can't allow an independent Ukraine, that means that they physically have to take the whole thing and install a regime friendly to them.
This is what Medvedev. This is what Medvedev has been saying, Gonzalo and Brian.
Yeah.
Medvedev now he's saying it out loud. Okay, we're gonna take everything.
Yeah, I don't think he's kidding. I think
I know, but this is not the position. This is not the position of the Security Council. This is his personal position. I think in one of his, if I'm not mistaken, in one of his posts, he said that this was his own position.
No, I mean, granted, but I mean, like, look at it logically, right? Okay, suppose Russia takes over everything east of the Dnieper and south of Dnipropetrovsk, right, including Odessa, of course, right? So they're left with this rump Ukraine from the the west bank of the Dnieper all the way to the Polish border.
All the way to the Polish border, yes.
Yeah, and so what's NATO going to do? They're going to roll right up to Kiev and put missiles there. The Russians can't allow it. I mean, that would be just, you know, Ukraine 2.0 of having to go to war again. So my thinking is that at this time, their only solution is to take the whole country, install a friendly regime in Kiev, perhaps slice off the extreme west of Ukraine, including Lviv or Lvov or however you pronounce it. And Poland has a different name for it on top of it. And I'm stupid with languages, so I don't remember. but give that chunk to Poland as a sop, and potentially to create problems within NATO, within the EU, where Poland takes over.
And problems for Poland, because a lot of these people won't adapt living in Poland, and there's a lot of resentment against Ukrainians in Poland as well.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, a whole lot. And so the issue becomes, you know, I don't see any way for, I mean, unless something radically different changes. I mean, the Americans show up with a 1 million-man army or something like that. I don't see realistically.
It will never happen.
Yeah, no, I know, but I'm saying, you know, just, you know, if the direction of current travel continues, I think that, and I'd ask you both to check my logic to see if I'm wrong on this. If the direction of travel continues, then the Kiev regime will essentially run out of men, and they will have no more fighting force. And the Russians, who have 150,000 in southern Belarus, they have 150 to 200,000 here in Belgorod, right across the border from me, and another 150 to 200,000 in the south. That looks to me like an occupation army. And then that looks to me like, I mean, you don't put together those forces in these three places just for funsies. You do it because you're doing something with them. And so my thinking is that this army has been assembled because it is an occupying force. And the T-50s that they keep talking about, oh, 75-year-old tanks. Yeah, those are tanks for an occupying army, not for a fighting force. And you just roll in and take over the whole thing and start slicing it up and installing a new regime and potentially giving a slice of Transcarpathia to the Hungarians, extreme west of Ukraine to Poland, perhaps a sliver to Romania as a sop for Transnistria, and you know, reorganize the geopolitical chessboard. And then once you have a very friendly regime in Kiev, where you have a Russian general sitting in the National Security Council of the new Kiev regime to keep a good eye on them, only then do you withdraw your occupying force and kick out all the crazies, you know, all the neo-Nazi extremists into this rump Ukraine state and have it be like just this no man's land, this ruined country that would have a population of maybe 10, maybe 14 million people tops. And
10 maximum, exactly, considering everybody that left already.
Oh, yeah, because, I mean, the population of Ukraine now, of what the Kiev regime controls, I don't think it numbers more than 22 million. I've done back of the envelope math, and it seems to be around 22 million tops, which is less than half of what it had prior to.
Less than half of what they had, true.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's my logic at this time. Do either one of you see any holes in any?
No, it's a plausible scenario, but the problem is, what are you going to do with, I would say, at least 10 million people who have been completely brainwashed for the past 8 years?
You leave them in.
They are all potential terrorists, or if not terrorists, you know, in flesh and blood.
Well, the Russians have experience with that. You know, with insurgents.
Well, they do. Yes, it's in Chechnya. They do. But in Chechnya, we're a few 100,000, maybe, the ultra-radicalized. Now we're talking about millions.
Yeah, but how deep is that radicalization? And also, do keep in mind.
That's a very good question. Nobody knows. Nobody knows.
And nobody knows. Also, the Ukraine population is much more urbanized and does not have those religious ties that the Chechen rebels had. Which turns somebody who's politically dissatisfied into a religious radical who's willing to die for the cause. How many Ukrainians are actually willing to die for a cause like this? I don't know.
Excellent question. Nobody has this answer. Nobody.
Well, also, I mean, we can't expect. I don't think anyone should expect this conflict to be over quickly. Look at how long Russia has been working on Syria. Even though that there's a positive outcome on its way in Syria, think about how many years and how much work had to be done and how much patience had to be exercised. And I think it's going to be the exact same thing with Ukraine. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. And I think factors, I mean, we're talking about factors on the ground. We're also talking about all of these other ticking clocks that we've been talking about in this conversation, the financial system, de-dollarization. all of that's going to take a toll on what the U.S. is able to do in regards to Ukraine. That's going to change the dynamics on the ground. And then as that changes on the ground, it's going to help shape what Russia is and isn't able to do in regards to Ukraine. I think eventually they'll get there, but I think we all want to see this resolved as quickly as possible, but I think it is going to take a long time.
Absolutely. That's the realistic perspective.
I mean, it is a realistic perspective, and I see exactly where you're coming from, Brian. But I do have a sensation that this might be like World War I, where things were trundling along during the summer of 18, and then all of a sudden the German Empire just, it just lost it. It just collapsed because they had no more left to give.
Which brings me to a point, just to complement what you're just saying. Okay, the 1-2 sucker punch, if it happens simultaneously. De-dollarization, humiliation of NATO, happening in sync. Oof. Can you imagine if that happens?
It's kind of is happening. It's just like kind of slow-mo, but it's happening.
I know, it's for the moment it's slow motion. Can you imagine if this picks up speed? And of course, I would say the coup de grace is the famous Chinese delegation arriving in Riyadh and say, from now on, everything is on Petro-Yuan.
That would be the ultimate.
That's the ultimate.
Yeah, that really would be the ultimate. Oh, and it could happen because the agreement for the petrodollar was in August of -- It would be almost exactly 50 years later.
Exactly 50. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's possible. It's possible.
My thinking is that we are in World War III. This is World War III. And it started on February 24th. And
absolutely.
But it is not like the First or the Second World War, in that it's been like here and then in other places, it's been disparate. But this is all one conflict. And what it is, essentially, this global war that's taking place, is and this is why I find the whole thing so tragic. It's because the American leadership class is panicking over the fact that they are going to be just one more great power among 3, or potentially 4 with India, depending, right? Or how you measure Europe, it doesn't matter. But you see what I mean? That's all the reasons for this war. Yes. Because, I mean, there is no geopolitical interest, like actual, tangible, near-term geopolitical interest for the Americans to have, gone into this shit show. I mean,
there is, Gonzalo, sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
Dismembering Russia, taking over all the natural resources, first with regime change, and then bringing back Russia to what it was during the 90s. This is their rationale.
That's their rationale. Goal. That's their goal. But a near-term actual geopolitical interest that was touched by the Russians or the Chinese. None. They just decided we want that, and we don't want to be a second-tier power. Or we don't want to lose our status as the global hegemon. And by the very act of desiring to maintain their global hegemonic status, they're pissing it away. I just find that screamingly funny. I just find it the ultimate irony, No,
I think it's more tragic than that. It's if this was a Greek tragedy written by one of the greats, written by a Neo-Sophocles, we will have a lot of hubris. We would have a lot of choirs in the background singing gloomy tunes, and we would have a tragicomic aspect to the narrative of how can these people be so dumb to bring this upon themselves?
Well, I always think that John Kirby is the comedic relief. That.
Oh yeah, in some days he is. Yeah.
But but really, there is no reason for the Americans to have gone into this conflict. That's the thing that just boggles my mind. And they should have had the foresight to realize that by really just destabilizing the board, they were opening themselves to vulnerabilities that were obviously there, that have been there for, in certain cases, decades, insofar as deindustrialization is concerned. Insofar as the financial fragility, it has been in place since 2007, when they never fixed the banking in the United States. And they just put, they kept it up with spit and baling wire, as opposed to actually fixing the financial situation in the US and the Western economy. And so it's just like, how? Brian, save me. I'm like out of ideas.
Hubris. That's
Yeah,
the ancient Greeks still teach us everything. You know, it's hubris essentially.
They're obsessed with hegemony. They were pursuing it at all costs. They ran out of time they had this grand plan of encircling and containing both Russia and China, and they ran out of time. And the world has fundamentally changed. Technology, finances, in terms of military power, the playing field is leveling, and they are a small percentage of the global population trying to control the entire global population. It's implausible. It's impractical, and plus they're out of time, and so they're in a completely irrational, fantastical position, and everything they try to build on top of that is likewise going to be skewed further and further away from reality. So it's just going to get worse until they come up with a rational role for themselves on the global stage with everyone else, instead of trying to impose themselves upon everyone else.
Well, but the only possible way out of this would be to get rid of all this Straussian neocon psycho gang, completely put them out of power in the US. And how do you do that? Because they
have to collapse.
Exactly. So this means that what our friend Ray McGovern says, best definition ever, mitzimat, no? Industrial, military, congressional, informational, think tank, media, academia, think tank complex. The whole thing would, in fact, this bubble, this blob, will have to collapse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It would be a similar process to the fall of the Soviet Union. So this is not completely a first in historical terms. One of the very first, like what Emmanuel Todd was predicting, and actually happened with the USSR. And it's fascinating because Todd is one of the, I would say, there are probably 4 or 5 decent French intellectuals nowadays. Todd is one of them. And now in his interviews, and obviously when he gives an interview like that to a major French publication, they freak out, but they have to publish it, because it's very, very important. And they have a lot of readers who would be extremely interested to hear Todd. And he's basically saying, look, it could go the same way. Of course, he agrees with all of us that we are already at World War III. That's no question. But he's talking about the internal process of how the empire is being corroded. There are some similarities to the fall of the Soviet Union. There's no question.
There most definitely is. I mean, you see the corruption of late Soviet Union,
Brezhnev,
where you had the party was completely corrupt and completely incompetent, and they were just sucking out all the resources of the people, which is very similar to what's happening now with the entrenched leadership class in the West, the cosmopolitan leadership class of the West, that is unresponsive to the people and just really sucking them dry. The difference, I think, between the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the West is that the collapse of the Soviet Union was remarkably peaceful. I mean, there was the bombing of the White House, and the sporadic violence, but it was not chaos. I am not so sanguine about the end of the Western regimes that it will be so peaceful. That's my concern, especially insofar as civil society is concerned. I think that what has happened too is that in the United States, in the West, with a lot of this Straussian wokeism nonsense, which has so inflamed people, and this charge of racism, whenever 2 people of different races come into contact in any kind of trivial dispute, a fender bender, whatever, automatically they talk about, oh, you're a racist, and that's why you're treating me like this, and it has nothing to do with racism. It was just a trivial fender bender. But the racial animosity and the internal lack of cohesion of the Western society, which is the same in Europe because of the massive influx of migrants. I think that this is just a powder keg of social chaos, unlike what happened in the Soviet Union. Do you see do you see my point?
No, I absolutely agree. I have started to write about that, and I want to get into more detail, in fact. and make some comparisons with the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of the USSR, and the fall of the current empire. No question. But in terms of anthropological disaster, we're already right in the middle of it. Yeah, with everything attached to it, the cognitive dissonance, cancel culture, exclusion of the other, wherever the other comes from, and the corrosion of the social tissue of the hegemon himself. You, as Americans, you guys, come on, you have lived that even before you moved away from the US, you know. And this is something that is starting to happen inside Europe, which is something that we could never imagine. You could see the social tissue in France, which prides itself of mission civilisatrice. We are the, you know, the land of liberty, equality, rules, Voltaire, Rousseau, all that crap. It's falling apart. Yeah. And I see in the city that I live over there, I see Paris becoming an enormous trash bin, literally. Yeah. Not only in terms of what Baudrillard would say, the degree zero of culture, but literally. The city is falling apart. And of course, real France, it's still alive in the provinces. If you go to Brittany or if you go to Normandy, you still experience ancestral Bourgogne, you experience ancestral France. And people are patriotic. And people are anti-European Commission, von der Leyen, EU, Borrell, Guard, and all that shit. But it's far away. And all the decisions in France are taken by Paris by a very tiny elite that studied in the same schools, went to the same clubs, went to the same parties. Yeah. Exactly, absolutely. Everybody went to ENA, École Nationale d'Administration, or Sciences Po. Exactly. And the same people, you know. And even it was fascinating. Something that happened to me yesterday, a few months after the beginning of the SMO, I was at a dinner in the countryside, but near Paris. And one of these high aristocracy guys, he was pissed with the whole system. Not only Brussels or Rio, but with Macronism as well. He said, these people are destroying what's left of our nation. So can you imagine this happening in France? No, it's so the corrosion, the social corrosion is all across the West. I cannot even imagine in Eastern Europe. I think none of us have been to Eastern Europe recently, no? So
well, I'm here.
No, but I mean Eastern Europe, Romania, Croatia, Bulgaria, you know. Hungary, I was in Poland.
I was in Hungary. Well, I was in Budapest, and I was in a bubble. It was lovely, you know. So
in a bubble,
I don't have anything intelligent to add about that. But you know, the West generally it just seems to be collapsing. And here's another difference between the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the West. You see, even when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were still income-producing assets in Russia post-Soviet collapse. So they could eke out a living and you know, rebuild. And frankly, if you think about the size of the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91, and think the distance traveled in barely a generation,
it's unbelievable. It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
I remember. Gonzalo, I was here.
But
I was lucky to be here. I arrived from the I took the Trans-Siberian in February 1992. I was traveling all around. I was in India and in China, so I barely knew that USSR was over. So I arrived from the Trans-Siberian in Moscow. Okay, I want to see Brzezinski's statue. I say, are you fucking nuts? We tore it down last week. And everybody was can you imagine, babushkas in the streets with broken dolls because they needed to sell what they had to eat.
Yeah.
I was mesmerized by what I saw. It took me months to process all that. And this was one of the reasons that brought me to live in Asia. Okay, first in Southeast Asia, but then everything, Russia, China, India, Southeast Asia. It was this trip and making this transition from the beginning of China, you know, super drive, which is what I saw in Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Beijing. And then you take the Trans-Siberian and you arrive at the end of an empire. Can you imagine? You know, it turns your life upside down, huh? Literally.
Yeah. Yeah,
so,
but to go back to the comparison, because this is something that has me, well, not awake at nights because I sleep like a log. So, you know, if the world catches fire, fuck it. You know, it's not my problem. You know, and after the show, I'll show you a picture I have of the building next to mine that got hit by a missile. It was pretty cool. You know, but anyway, the point is, I can't share it, chat. As soon as the war's over, I'll share it.
I'm sorry, it was hit by an Ukrainian missile, right?
No, a Russian missile. The building right.
Is there anything of value, military value, in this building besides yours?
It was. I can't say what it was specifically, but it was an administrative building. So obviously, somebody was meeting there that the Russians didn't want to meet or wanted them to meet their maker. I don't know, but
okay,
I'll show it to you after. And chat, I'm sorry, I can't show it to you now because it would reveal my location because of the skyline is clearly visible. But the point I wanted to make is that, see, when the Russians collapsed, they had resources because, yeah, the poor babushka selling dolls, that was all she had, poor thing. But the Russian economy had something to lift it up.
They were producing everything at the time.
Exactly. But the Western economies, because of the financialization of the Western economies and the deindustrialization,
they don't produce anything anymore. Exactly. Yes.
They don't.
Yes.
They don't have anything the rest of them wants. Brian.
Yeah. Although, just think about when the Soviet Union collapsed, the West descended on it like vultures, and they were trying to strip the flesh from their bones. And that complicated the collapse, and it also obviously complicated the recovery. Although you could say that, you know, the backlash against that was a catalyst for rebuilding Russia stronger. But I think that when the U.S. this whole system collapses, I think other nations are going to want to work with whoever the new circles of power, as long as they're being rational this time. I think they will work with them to rebuild the U.S. I don't think they're going to kick them while they're down. Everybody wants to work with the West, and they're just kind of waiting for the clock to run out with these people running things right now. They want them gone so that they could go back to doing business. And it's hard for Americans to understand this because in their mind, they're at war with the world. They assume everyone is at war with them. And in reality, no, people just want to actually do business, build things. I think this is at the root of the West's current problem. Their ultimate goal is the problem. Look at China, look at Russia. What is their goal? They want to build their society as strong as possible, and they invest in that. And all we see in the United States is we want to extend our power and our control and absorb wealth from as far away as possible. This is two totally different mentalities, and it really is playing a role into how everything is unfolding and will unfold.
Absolutely correct. And that ties up with Michael's book, in fact. It's basically the creditor oligarchy in the West wants to run whatever there is to run for their own benefit and screw the slaves.
Yeah.
That's it, essentially. So nothing has changed much in 2,000 years, right?
No, exactly. No, in many ways, no. I mean, well, you know, I remember the famous phrase from Bill Clinton. I think it was in '93 or '94 when he was complaining that, you know, the fucking New York bond salesman won't allow me to do some policy that he wanted to do. I forget what it was, but yeah, the bondholders won't let you do it. You know, and so the issue becomes if there is my thinking is that the Western crash, we will see much more repression, and as much more censorship, a much more control of media, social media, and all the rest of it. And as the crash happens, those in positions of leadership, the cosmopolitan leadership class that is holding on, they are going to redouble their efforts to maintain control of this collapsing empire, and they might do anything. That's the thing that scares me.
Yes.
Okay, because at least when the Soviets collapsed, you know, the old men in charge in the Kremlin, right? They weren't completely off their rocker, but the people in the West seem to be just completely insane.
Exactly.
I mean, yeah. Look, we've been going on for almost 2 hours. We've gone on for an hour and 48 minutes. I think it's been a delightful conversation. And Pepe, unfortunately, has to go.
I need to go at 6, unfortunately.
Yeah, and so we can't talk for very much longer. I hate to hit you this at the last minute, but are there any final thoughts that you want our viewers to leave with, insofar as anything of interest, quite frankly, quite apart from the book? By the way, I pinned the Michael Hudson book, The Collapse of Antiquity, so that people will read it. But anything you'd like to leave our viewers with as a final thought?
Brian, you want to go?
Well, first of all, thank you again, Gonzalo, for having me on. Pepe, I mean, I have been following you for years, and you have been talking about multipolarism before it was cool. So if people aren't already following you, they should, because you've been talking about this and laying it out for years and years, and you really have a good conceptual grasp of why it is and what it is. And I think people should just continue. We see the world investing in multipolarism. We as individuals, we can also do that. We can contribute in all kinds of ways, supporting alternative media, supporting companies and interests and institutions that are outside the West's unipolar world order. We could all play a role, and that's what it is. It's everybody doing little things that add up over time. No one single person, even no one single country is going to change all of this, even between Russia and China. They understand they have to work together. So I think that is what we have to understand about multipolarism. And I think we just need to stay on target. And we have to see this through, because I think humanity, its future depends on it.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. Yes, I couldn't agree more. And for all of us in the media, of course, we know that we are a minority in Western terms. We are a majority in Global South terms, no question about that. But the fact that we basically address Western audiences puts us in a very complicated position, because, of course, we have to explain what it's for us is obvious over and over again, nonstop. And we have to try something that I would say nowadays is absolutely impossible. Engage our adversaries in some sort of critical thinking. So this is where our battle becomes almost, insurmountable. But we should keep trying, of course. Yeah. And in terms of where we're going next, wow. Xi Jinping came up with a wonderful formulation: changes we have not seen in 100 years. Yeah. I would say changes we have not seen in 2,000 years. Okay, let's go deeper than that, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, we're not going to become horseback nomads like the Scythians in the 7th century BC from today to another, no? But we're going to maybe become pilgrims of the new Silk Road, which is going to be global. And one day we're going to have trade and connectivity globally with the people's exchange, peoples to peoples exchange, as the Chinese put it, which I found it a fantastic term, which is exactly what happened during the ancient Silk Roads. Yeah. When I travel in, for instance, this summer I was between Bukhara and Samarkand. I was marveling about everything nonstop. And basically I found instances of, there was this Jewish trader that came from the middle of nowhere in Anatolia, and he brought some stuff that he sold here, and vice versa. There was some Tang Dynasty pilgrim that showed up in Bukhara with something that he didn't have, and they said, let's copy this, let's make a new ceramic. This is what it is, peoples to peoples exchange. You move back and forth, you travel, you talk to the other respects you, and you respect the other, which is something that the West completely forgot. So maybe we are on our way to get there again in historical terms. But we have to be vigilant.
Yeah. For my part, I want to just leave you with a final thought. I did a Twitter thread about this a couple of weeks ago, I think. See, I actually sat down and figured out how much money I could have made if I had gotten on the mainstream media bullshit, okay? And I want to tell you, the figure that I came up with was fairly radical. It was in the 7 figures, in the low 7 figures, but 7 figures nevertheless.
I think the three of us, it would apply to the 3 of us and many of our independent friends. We will be millionaires by now.
We could have made a lot of money, of course, because I happened to be in Kiev when the SMO started, and if I just followed the mainstream media bullshit, the lies, I could have parlayed that into appearances on MSNBC. I would have been the darling, out there in the front, citizen journalist, shit like that. I could have had a book deal, and I've had book deals before, so I know how to play that game, and movie deals. And all 3 of us could have done that if we just lied
If we just lie, but we refuse. That's I think it's our major strength. We refuse to lie, and we will never lie. That's it.
Yeah, because I mean, we could, each of us could be wrong, which is different. Because if I'm saying something that I believe at the time to be true, but then facts emerge and show that I was wrong, I don't have a problem changing my mind. And I don't think that either Pepe or Brian are any different.
Of course not. And we admit to our mistakes,
Yeah, because, mistake means nothing. We all make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. But the issue is lying. Lying when you know the truth. And there are so many people, I would venture to say almost everyone in the mainstream, who all they do is lie. I was reading a recent article by Douglas Murray, who came to Kherson, and the lie that off the New York Post column that he wrote, saying that, for instance, 80,000 civilians had been killed by the Russians in Mariupol. What? Jesus. And it's still there, by the way. You can look it up. Yeah. Don't take my word for it. Go looking for it yourself. I can send you a link if you want. See, the lies, okay? And so the thing that you have to value is not somebody who's perfectly accurate all the time. You have to, value somebody who is accurate to the best of his ability, and when he's wrong, he's willing to admit it. See, and not follow the bullshit. That's the final message I want to leave you all with. Absolutely. To my guest, Pepe Escobar. Pepe's
Thank you very much.
My pleasure as always, man. His link to his Telegram channel is below, and right there in Rock and Roll Geopolitics, they can find links to your work and everything else, right?
Yes, absolutely, and on Twitter as well. We're both. The three of us. We are on Twitter.
Yeah. Finally back. Thank God.
Exactly. Finally back. Exactly.
Brian, thank you as always. I have Brian's Twitter down below, and at his Twitter you can find his fantastic YouTube channel, The New Atlas, which is really, the fact that Alexander Mercouris, references Brian just about in every broadcast, that tells you all you need to know. It's fantastic.
It is very flattering. Yes.
No, it's a pleasure having you on again, my friend. Thank you so much for coming. Guys, stick around for just a couple of minutes. I want to show you a couple of things. And I think that we're all good. Chat, I hope you enjoyed the show, and I will catch you on Thursday. Take it easy.